Chapter 14, Avoiding Armageddon. There is a reason I criticize religion more than other ideologies, and it's not because they aren't as dangerous. The reason I criticize religion in particular is because generally it is the first place people learn to believe things without evidence. Not only is faith an acceptable way of thinking in religious circles, it is considered a virtue. Something to be encouraged rather than avoided. Something to be praised rather than shunned. This is clearly a problem because it has downstream effects in our culture. If one can choose to suspend their critical thinking when it comes to religious matters, why wouldn't they do the same when it comes to politics? Or their economic views? Or their opinions on social issues? Why wouldn't superstitious thinking plague their careers? Or their medical decisions? Or the way they raise children? Once irrationality is deemed socially acceptable, there's no telling what negative consequences it will have. As the Spanish painter Francis Goya once said, the sleep of reason produces monsters, and by teaching our children to put their reason to sleep we are inadvertently making their minds vulnerable to future delusion. Imagine instead a world in which we don't indoctrinate children from a young age. A world where spiritual topics are seldomly discussed until students are old enough to evaluate the evidence for themselves. If religion was not presented to people until an intellectually mature age, would anyone accept it? Would any person literate in biology believe the tale of a talking snake? Would any person educated in physics agree with the claims of a young Earth? It might seem harmless to entertain a little mysticism on a Sunday morning, but understand that the beliefs we hold influence our actions. As we speak, the technological power of our species grows. This means that the repercussions of believing false information have greatly amplified. For instance, if you believe God controls the weather, you might disregard the threats of climate change. If you reject evolution, you might fail to anticipate the mutations of a pandemic-causing pathogen. If you think holy war is a good thing, you might feel reluctant to stop international conflicts. All of these are potential outcomes of falling victim to lies. It is also clear that the positive trends I attributed to technology in the previous chapter can be made to serve evil if they fall into the wrong hands. Our medical technology can be used to make bioweapons. Our green energy technology can be repurposed to make atomic bombs. Even our agricultural breakthroughs can collapse ecosystems if used unsustainably. While it is popular to say, let people believe what they want, it is important that we persuade our peers out of magical thinking, because the consequences of being wrong have never been so detrimental. It matters greatly what those wielding power think, and in this world we all have a little power. This is why it is imperative that the principles of reason be widely accepted. Civilization is fragile, and there are a myriad of ways it could be destroyed, yet when you look at the list of likely perpetrators they generally fall into two camps. Those who have the capacity to end civilization but not the intent, and those who have the intent to end civilization but not the capacity. There is a reason why the United States and the Soviet Union never launched a first strike during the Cold War. To put it simply, they didn't want to die. As evil as communism was, and as sinister a force as Western imperialism was, neither of the nations' leaderships wanted to risk a global extinction event. Surely they wanted to dominate their adversaries and expand their sphere of influence, but when it came to gambling with the lives of every man, woman, and child on Earth, they ultimately said no. We are unbelievably fortunate that the world's nuclear nations have behaved with sufficient safety so far. However, to assume this behavior will continue is to do so at our collective peril. All that would be needed to trigger a disaster worse than 100 holocausts would be for the wrong person with the wrong intentions to be in a position of political power. As long as industrial military institutions exist, they will continue churning out weapons of unimaginable lethality, and as long as these weapons exist, we are all equally at the mercy of those who control them. Now you might be asking, who would be crazy enough to make such a decision? Who would choose to use these weapons knowing it would mean their demise as well? To answer that, we only need to look at recent history. The Columbine school shooters Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold shot 36 of their fellow schoolmates before killing themselves shortly after. This resulted in a series of copycat shootings where deeply disturbed young men attempted suicidal massacres of their own. Nowadays, school shootings are a common part of life in America, and the death toll from their exploits grows higher every day. In the world of religion, we see something similar. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers, killing thousands in an act of violent martyrdom. This too has been followed by waves of subsequent terrorism, with Islamic extremists shooting, bombing and driving vehicles into an unsuspecting public. The point of these murders, whether they're ideologically motivated or not, is to inflict death and suffering upon others, even if it means the annihilation of the perpetrator. In this way, there are three types of people who pose a uniquely great threat to civilization: the fundamentalist, the hateful nihilist, and the insanity-ridden fool. The reason these individuals are particularly dangerous is because death is not a deterrent for them. Religious fundamentalists don't fear death because they've been told there is a supernatural existence awaiting them. They believe in paradise or reincarnation, or that they're following God's will. If you believe there is a life after this world, it is far easier to throw away your life on something destructive. And if you're willing to disregard your own life so easily, one can only imagine what you might do to others. The hateful nihilists, on the other hand, are different. They have no faith, nor principles, nor ideology of any kind. Their life is devoid of purpose, and their sense of right and wrong is lacking. For them, life is about pursuing their desires and nothing more. And when their minds become occupied with violent, murderous and self-destructive fantasies, there's no real argument to dissuade them from their course. This relates directly with those who are insane, and depending on their mental condition, may not even understand the damage they're causing. Now, luckily, none of these individuals have a nuclear arsenal at their disposal, but this could change at any time. The United States, which prides itself on its secular form of government, also has a high propensity for theocratic and superstitious thinking. Nearly half of the population rejects evolution, 33% deny anthropogenic climate change, and a growing number dispute the efficacy of vaccines in modern medicine. These beliefs regularly interfere with common-sense health policy and bolster the popularity of politicians with misanthropic views. To make matters worse, among Christians, there is a school of thought known as Armageddon theology, which states that the end of the world described in the book of Revelation is a good thing, and that believers should act in ways that make this future come about. President George W. Bush once said, "God told me to end the tyranny in Iraq," and this means that one of his reasons for prosecuting a war that killed over 1 million people was that he felt divinely inspired. Had the United States elected someone just a little more radical, or a little more sympathetic to Armageddon theology, it's possible our weapons of mass destruction may have already been used. This has a parallel in the Islamic world, where apocalyptic Muslims behave in eerily similar ways to fundamentalist Christians. They too support pseudoscience and theocratic legal systems, and while fringe groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are the most notorious examples of this, it unfortunately applies to nation-states as well. Iran, which to this day is a theocracy, has an active nuclear program. At the moment they are using it exclusively for energy, but there are no guarantees about how long this will last. The widespread Islamic belief in paradise makes jihadism a significant threat. And since their leadership has repeatedly called for the destruction of the West and Israel, we as an international community need to keep an eye on them. One of the most unfortunate aspects of recent history is the return of sectarian violence to the Middle East. As this is being written, proxy wars are being waged with local Shiite militias taking on local Sunni militias for the right of territorial rule in Yemen and Syria. These militias in turn are being backed by Saudi Arabia and Iran, who themselves are engaged in a sinister Cold War. The fear is that as Iran develops its nuclear capacity, Saudi Arabia will do the same. There is some limited evidence this has already occurred, and this is a particularly concerning threat, because Saudi royals in the past have been responsible for funneling money and supplies to jihadist groups. The sympathy for terrorism in the region is simply too high to allow weapons of mass destruction to freely proliferate. And when two well-armed forces share the view that God has blessed their genocidal ambitions and death is no longer a deterrent, the door is open for the worst kind of violence to occur. This could be no more apparent than in India and Pakistan, where both religious tension and nuclear capacity already exists. Hindu nationalists and Islamic chauvinists frequently quarrel over territory and ideology, and if one of them were to choose a violent first strike, the technology is already there to kill hundreds of millions. The world is rife with present-day examples of unchecked fundamentalism, and when we look back at the 20th century regimes that nearly ruled the world, we find something utterly disturbing. Imperial Japan, which routinely launched suicidal kamikaze attacks against its Pacific opponents, also had a biological weapons program. The regime would drop deadly fleas infected with bubonic plague onto Chinese cities, and until 1945 had plans to launch similar attacks on American soil. Adolf Hitler, who was both a fundamentalist and insanity-ridden fool, had Nazi scientists working for him on atomic weapons. When it was decided that the war was hopeless and he would inevitably lose, he ordered the destruction of Germany's infrastructure, not caring for the nation's well-being if it meant striking one last blow at the Allies. Now ask yourself this: what would the Axis powers have done with nuclear weapons? What would they have done with the ability to modify viruses or create natural disasters? In hindsight, no one can know what would have really happened, but considering the high death toll in our timeline, it couldn't have been good. Mass murderers seldomly slow down when given more efficient tools, and as we look to the present, we find those tools are only spreading. In each of these cases, we see how personal decisions nearly led to the destruction of civilization. Had the nuclear-armed regimes been slightly more fundamentalist, there would have been disaster. Had fundamentalist regimes been slightly more nuclear, there would have been disaster. Considering the fact that nuclear weapons have proliferated to 9 different countries, each of which possesses deadly chemical and bioweapons as well, we must seriously consider radical forms of disarmament. These weapons have existed for less than 100 years, and already there have been several close calls which almost resulted in war. From the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis to the 1983 Soviet false alarm, how long can this go on before a mistake is made? How powerful can our tools get before they become the ruin of us all? The responsible use of technology is the great imperative of our time. To get this question right is to solve all problems from war to pollution to disease to famine to poor education. The only way it can be accomplished is if everyday people understand the principles of reason. Not just the leaders in office, but the public they're meant to serve. If reason is more widely understood, people will be less likely to subscribe to fundamentalist ideologies. And if secular humanist values are more widely promoted throughout the culture, people will be far less likely to succumb to nihilism. While it is true that we will never be able to completely rid the world of wicked people, we can prevent individuals displaying these traits from being given political and technological power. Understand that Hitler alone couldn't have killed 6 million Jews. It took an obedient population of Germans to follow his orders. Similarly, the 9/11 hijackers could never have killed 3,000 people alone. They needed the assistance of advanced technology to amplify their death toll. If we can manage to prevent world-altering technologies from falling into insidious hands, we may have a planet to enjoy in the coming centuries. Failure to do this, however, could result in a quick end to our species. So what do we do? It starts with helping everyday people realize their power. In a democracy, this is typically done by exercising the right to vote and protest. However, even in dictatorships, it is ultimately the citizenry who have power. If farmers don't grow food, the regimes are starved. If electrical workers don't perform maintenances, government buildings lose power. If truckers and merchants abandon their routes, cities are cut off from supplies. Even law itself is predicated on enforcement. If enforcement officers in either the police or military choose to be non-compliant, the very foundation of political authority collapses instantaneously. It is only by our consent that leaders rule and systems function. So whether it be strategic voting, mass disobedience, or in extreme cases, outright violence, the people ultimately have the power to stop the world from going to ruin. We have to make sure that no matter what part of the world you're from, no matter what culture you belong to, you oppose the self-destructive use of technology. Our leaders cannot be allowed to destroy the environment. They cannot be allowed to produce ever more powerful weapons that have the ability to wipe out billions. Just as we can use our machines to level cities and wreak havoc on the environment, we can also put them towards the betterment of humanity. Our tools can cure diseases. They can automate jobs. They can educate millions. And produce food in ethically sustainable ways. If we continue to alleviate poverty and child abuse, while strengthening our dependence on international trade and cooperation, it's possible we might even get a world without the kind of violence which currently characterizes it. All of this is achievable if everyday people demand more from their society. It's not at all obvious that we will succeed in preventing the destruction of human civilization. But if we do, it will be because everyday people choose it. What we believe in our minds and feel in our hearts matters. Which is why the topics of meaning, morality, and epistemology are so important to discuss. Our civilization is on the precipice of so many unbelievably beautiful achievements. But if we continue to make self-destructive decisions, we will never live to see them. I personally want to see what the surface of foreign planets look like. I want to be able to tell every cancer patient in the hospital that we have a cure. And so when I'm asked, how do we save the world, my answer is very simple. The way we save the world is by saving our minds first.